Okay, hello everybody, and welcome back to the Doomer Optimism podcast. I am here with, out of retirement, Jason Snyder, Chris Smaje, a
Hi.
friend of the podcast, the original old school crew. We are organizing this talk about this recent NS Lyons piece that is in reference to this R.R. Reno First Things editor book called Strong Gods. And I was just really taken by the argument, this sort of strong gods and weak gods argument. Maybe because I was just rushing in late to this interview, one of you can summarize it briefly as you understand it. And then we can talk a little bit about the implications of if this theory is correct, this sort of strong gods and weak gods, and we're sort of returning to an era of strong gods, what does that mean? And what would be a better or worse way to go back to an era of strong gods, if it is in case the material fact? So welcome both of you. Will one of you want to take a stab at describing the argument?
I think Chris would. He wrote an article about it, so
Oh, yeah, okay, good. All right, we'll put you on the spot, Chris.
Fair enough. I write a lot of articles and then forget what I said in them, but yeah, I mean, it was an interesting article. I mean, very brief summary, I suppose. He sort of talked in terms of periodizations of centuries. So what he and others have called the long 19th century, starting with the French Revolution in 1789. And then right through to the First and Second World Wars was, in his view, a time of sort of great confidence in Western civilization and sort of imperialism, economic growth, industrial revolution, progress and so on. And that kind of died a death with World War. And his argument is so that, if you like, was the period of strong gods, kind of nation building, nationalism, great cultural confidence. That came to an end with World War. I mean, one thing he doesn't mention, which I think is important, is also the depression, the market crash, the sort of demise of that kind of very aggressive, rapacious sort of capitalist model. But maybe we'll get onto that. So then, after World War II, he says we were into the what he calls the long 20th. I think he calls it the long 20th century. It should really be the short 20th century, maybe. But post World War II, so a sense of genocide, World War, trade war, nationalistic conflict. Never again. Sort of Hitler is the kind of the shadow stalking the latter part of the 20th century. So we have to create a more multilateral global order. We have to sort of stop nationalism getting out of hand. We have to promote a more open society, tolerance, the United Nations, etc., etc. So his argument is that that period is now coming to an end, and Trump in the election of Trump in the United States sort of marks is some sort of watershed in that period. And he frames it in terms of the return of the strong gods, the return of nationalism, a sense of in Trump's case, America first, a sense of being connected to community, a sense of being bound to something larger rather than this kind of globalism, globalization, open society. So that in a nutshell, I don't know if that sounds a reasonable summary. That in a nutshell is what he was arguing.
Yeah, do you have anything you want to add, Jason?
Yeah, I'll just note too that he tends to underemphasize that it was also in response to communism. It was a response to the Soviet bloc and China, and so this kind of weak gods, new world order to prevent these conflicts. It was both responding to the rise of fascism and World War, but it was also responding to, it was competing against especially the Soviet bloc, right? And So you have this kind of system that both emphasizes kind of, you can say, openness, tolerance, but also free trade, right, and capitalism, right. And so it was both. So you get almost this kind of union or the synthesis of progressive liberalism with the rise of rapacious global industrial capitalism as this kind of marriage made in heaven. That is the only way. It's the only way. All other systems lead to mass carnage and death, right. And that was the idea. The more countries trade with each other, the less they're likely to go to war. And so this is the only way. And that seems to have been the mantra all the way, at least through the Obama administration.
Mm.
And now we're seeing perhaps the rise of strong gods again. We don't know if they're the same gods. They might be different strong gods, right? Um, are we confident that we really want to see the rise of strong gods again? Right? Do we know what we're asking for? I think all of these things are a little bit unaddressed in his article, but interesting
Mm.
nonetheless.
Yeah, so I think like this is the point I think of this conversation because as I was reading this original the piece by NS Lyons, I haven't read the Reno book, but then listening to NS Lyons on Unheard, um, first I want to separate out one question, and then we can talk a little bit about, like strong gods is such a it's a I think it's a really compelling descriptor of the period that we're probably entering into. But what it like which strong gods, which would we prefer? And another thing I thought was missing was the sort of ecological, environmental, resource material part of the story, which is, a lot of us have this thinking about, sort of cheap energy, and then a lot of things are downstream of this sort of cheap energy, including the, rise of this global capitalist system, which we think we're probably on the far side of now. And a lot of it maybe is just material in nature, this sort of pushback against like the weak gods. But first, I want to ask, before we even move on to those questions, are you convinced? Are both of you convinced by this argument? Do you think that we are moving from a weak God period of global order, the end of history, increasingly interconnected economies to deglobalization or something more multipolar or something more localist? Are we going in that direction? Are you convinced that that is the direction we're going? Are you convinced by the argument? Chris, you want
Who's
to
going to
go?
go? I mean, I broadly agreed with his critique of what he called the weak gods, post-war, the sort of bureaucratization, the sort of some of the weaknesses of this of liberalism. Um, I mean, I do think, the emission that Jason mentioned is important, and also the fact that, that emerged out of, yeah, depression and the economic crash in the 1930s. So he's kind of, yeah, part of that response was to the immiseration of ordinary people in that period, which he kind of glosses over. And he's got this extraordinary quote from Mary Harrington about Elon Musk being, restoring people's or restoring masculine pride or something. And I kind of think of Elon Musk as a sort of 19th century style robber baron who destroyed a lot of masculine pride. So that really doesn't play with me. And also, as Jason said, the sort of we are moving to a different world order, and the demise of communism, the rise of China, and I think the sort of post-war Bretton Woods agreement is an important context where the US kind of agreed to be the world's global policeman. And I think partly, I mean, obviously I'm not based in the US, but my sense is that there's a little bit of a resentment in the US about that now. It's like, we've paying for all this, global world order stuff, this global security. I mean, there is the other side to that is sort of making the US dollar the sort of global world, global reserve currency. The US got a pretty sweet deal out of things, really, in the 1940s. And, that's, if I can sort of try and understand what the hell is going on with the Trump administration, it's almost like trying to, create a kind of new Bretton Woods type agreement that's kind of more beneficial to the United States. And I don't think that's going to happen. I think it's an attempt to sort of retain US superpower status in a way that, the times have changed. I think, he's really sort of a bit like Don Quixote on the wall behind me here. He's kind of tilting at windmills. But in terms of the weak and strong gods, one of the problems I have I mean, I kind of agree with him that, there's something, a lot of people feel oppressed by bureaucracy and proceduralism and sort of big state stuff. And, we want life to be more exciting but, he's very sort of uncritical about nationalism. Nationalism is absolutely a project of the sort of liberal state. It's sort of making people think what's going on in Washington DC is more important, than what's going on in the town hall. It's kind of articulating this sort of big national project. And I don't, the sort of strong gods, weak gods thing is a bit weird to me. He's kind of saying that dialogue, is a weak god thing, like sort of trying to talk and understand somebody else is weak. To my mind, it's kind of strong. If you're strong enough to kind of not to roll over and sort of be dominated by someone else, but strong enough to have a dialogue, understand where somebody else is coming from. That's not a position of weakness. So I think I jotted it down somewhere. He talked about, national and civilizational self-worth. And that seems weird to me. Like, why do we have to embrace, the nation, all these people we don't know, what's going on in Washington, D.C., or the notion of Western civilization as being somehow strong when, a lot of us don't even, can't produce our own livelihood, don't know how to grow a garden. I mean, in my blog post, I know it's not going to play well with certain kind of MAGA opinion that, being a householder, being in a relationship, having kids, growing a garden, it doesn't sound very strong God. But why not? Why not? Being part of a community, a family, a neighborhood, knowing how to make a livelihood for yourself rather than sort of investing in some wild notion of Western civilization or, making America great. Why is that strong? That I think is quite problematic.
Yeah.
I think that the terms are a bit confused as well. I mean, if what we've had for the last 80 years are weak gods, these weak gods are pretty strong, right? The American-led world order, uh, provided the container for these so-called weak gods to flourish, but the American-led world order was a pretty strong god, right? So maybe what he's advocating for is multiplicity of strong gods, i.e., multipolar order,
Mhm.
among nations, which, again, this leads to, I guess, two critiques I would have. One is, do we really want to go down that road again at at this kind of nation state conflict? And two, is the nation state even the scale that we should even be thinking about?
Right.
He does mention strong gods as not just being related to the state, but being related to, notions of family and, faith and legacy and these kind of localist, ideals, I guess you could say. So it doesn't have to be at the state level, but that seems to be what he emphasizes.
Hmm.
And I guess the question is, like, if you want to return to the multiplicity of strong gods and maybe a huge multiplicity, including very localist strong god values, and we can talk about what those might mean. Who's going to be the strongest god of all? Who's going to let all of these minor strong gods play in the playground without destroying each other?
Yeah. Yeah.
What's the answer, Jason?
Well, USA, man, we got to just keep, we got to keep our position in the world. That's how we, I don't know.
But I think
No,
that's an important, yeah, that's an important point. I think that, yeah, there is this, I think there's a kind of wanting to have your cake and eat it, and I mean, Trump has sort of said that we need to keep the dollar as a sort of global reserve currency, otherwise we end up with sort of third world status, and I think, I certainly agree with I don't like the sort of nation state competition and a sort of global world trading order. A lot of the conversations we've had over the years has all been about localism, and we've got way too much kind of sort of financialization and sort of symbolic capital floating around that sort of prevents us from having sort of ground up sort of real localism, real sort of sustainable livelihoods. So, in as much as it's an argument against sort of the global trading order and all of that sort of thing, I agree with him. But I think the problem is there does seem to be this sort of wanting your cake and eating it sort of thing. Trump's tariffs. I mean, there's all sorts of different ways to try and understand that, but I mean, ultimately, that's going to cause economic pain that will be borne by ordinary people. If you go down that sort of protectionist route in order to genuinely generate a kind of sustainable, renewable local economies, then maybe there's a case for it. But I don't, that's not really. I think what's motivating it. It's more a sense of kind of reindustrialization on the old sort of global trade model that I don't think is going to work. So that's I think that's a problem with it. It's it's too much of the weak God thinking sort of grafted onto this notion of kind of strong identity to place or faith or whatever, which I think are important things to talk about, but it doesn't quite cut it within this Trumpian framework.
Right. Okay. So I'll say what I thought of the piece, which is, or whether or not I think it's accurate. I was thinking about this more, and maybe we could talk a little bit about this because this is something I thought that the piece was missing. From a resource and energy perspective, the thing that we've talked about on this podcast a million times is, on the upswing of super cheap energy, you're able to do things that are unprecedented in history. You're just able to have a level of wealth and a level of interconnectedness and, this globalized system that never before existed and probably is just a blip in human history. So on the far side of that, what is it going to look like? What will it look like to deglobalize or relocalize or have less abundant energy? I think this argument is basically like the cultural side of that question. It's just sort of like how people are making sense of this sort of failure of this international system that's promised sort of like mass abundance and mass happiness, and it's not delivering on that. And it feels like there are these leaders far away who are making decisions, and they're bureaucrats and you have no idea who they are, and there's just this cabal, global cabal, you don't know who they are. And so I'm convinced by the argument that people are responding to this via some kind of populist impulse. Whether Europe, you see these populist leaders, and you see this, I would call Trump's the MAGA thing a populist, in the sense of, like, I want to just return more power to the people or closer to me, people who I know, not this like cabal of bureaucrats. What I think we've been talking about so far in the podcast is, I think that impulse is just super messy amongst the populace and amongst the populist leaders. They don't really know, like, they're not thinking about it in the way that we're talking about it here. They're just sort of like, I mean, at least how I'm reading Musk and Trump, it's just sort of like just blindly shooting at various targets, and you don't even really know what you wanted to get out of these targets, and you're kind of like trying things and seeing what works and who pushes back and then like reacting. That's how it looks like. Very, very messy. Do you both agree about the sort of like big picture resource level that we're in, and that we're like on the downswing of that, and people are just like confusingly trying to make sense of it and just reacting? Does that ring true to you both? Or would you
Yeah.
refine that in any
Yeah,
way?
it's there. You can debate forever about, when is peak oil and when is peak affluence. And when people have tried to predict that, they've usually gotten it wrong. We seem to be still in a period of pretty peak affluence, in relative terms. However, there seems to be, the global system seems to have to keep, you know, long term undermining itself in order to keep this whole show going, right? Whether it's getting into more and more debt or what have you. And so there might be, I think what you're saying, you're arguing is that there's kind of like a cultural reflection of our economic situation that it's not healthy, and there's kind of a cultural sense of that this is the case, but it's not defined in those terms.
Yeah.
And I think that, I mean, I've been thinking about that for quite a while. Like, what is the kind of, you know, if there is forced degrowth, or if there's, uh, decline in global living standards, what are going to be the cultural mimetic implications of that? Because I think, I don't think most people are going to be able to necessarily accurately pinpoint, okay, we're running out of oil, or we're running out of resources, or we're in so much debt that we're paying off more interest than we get in annual tax rates. And so like that might not be what people recognize as the issue. It'll be a cultural manifestation, some kind of mimetic god, right? It's Moloch, or it's some scapegoat that we have to destroy, or it's something else. And so I think that there might be something to that.
Yes, I mean,
Yeah.
I've always like sort of looked at the news and when at all possible looked at like sort of conflicts through material lens, and they'll say, "Oh, it's just sectarian violence that's like popping up for some reason." But there's no real explanation as to why just these two groups are fighting with each other now. Okay, well, what's the like underlying resource constraint? Like the Arab Spring has started over like a piece of bread, a loaf of bread or whatever, and there's a material underpinning to a lot of these things. And so my goal for this discussion is then to say, okay, if there is a material underpinning and we are going in this direction and people are feeling it, then what? And so I think Chris is right. His critique of just kind of like generally being like cool with the way it's going, and it's just like, oh, strong gods again, great, like um that's not smart either. So if we take that as an assumption that we're in this like new material direction, which parts? This is the thing that's been plaguing me, and I want to talk to you both about which parts of the weak God order. If we're just going to take this assumption that we're this the argument's directionally correct, which parts of the weak God order do we want to preserve? And which parts of the strong God order do we welcome? And so I think like maybe Chris, I'll toss it to you because I was thinking as we started when Jason said, all other the argument in the beginning of this, globalist system is every other system leads to mass death. If we
Uh,
don't do this globalist system, it's either Hitler or it's mass death via communist systems. Like either way, you've got mass death, and only the globalist system will keep you alive. And obviously, you've written several books arguing against that point of view. So you would welcome an alternative to that globalist system that might look like strong gods, but maybe much closer to home than what's described in the argument of, nationalism. So let's
uh,
start sketching that out a little bit.
yeah, it's an interesting one. I mean, I think, I think Jason's framing in terms of communism, in the past is important, and it kind of there was a lot of soft power, hard and soft power associated with that. So now I think we're seeing more of all this stuff about taking over Greenland or Canada. I mean, I don't know how serious that is, but I think ultimately we're gonna see more of that, and it's gonna be hard to at a time when the US was offering other countries opportunities in the context of uniting against a wider enemy, communism. That made sense. I think I'm not sure if I can't really see it working. And I think, the US under Trump has already lost a lot of, or even pre-Trump has lost a lot of soft power. So I think, yeah, we're moving more towards this, multilateral localist. I mean, take it from me, coming from Britain, that used to be the sort of dominant world power up until the early 20th century, before the US took over. And we still haven't really come to terms with the fact that we're less important than we think we are. So I think there's gonna be a lot of aftershocks to all this. But I think, and again, another thing that Jason said interested me. I can't remember exactly how you framed it, but it was like, who is going to be the strong God? And I think, Jason and I were just chatting before we went live, and I guess I feel like we pay, and NS Lyons pays way too much kind of obeisance to whoever's in the corridors of power, in Washington DC, or London or Brussels. The strong gods at one level are us in our local communities, doing our things, building connection. We don't, there's going to be Trump or whoever else is in the White House. There's going to be these peoples in positions of power. They're always going to fail at these kind of grandiose projects, and increasingly so. I mean, as I said, I kind of agree with NS Lyons' critique of the failure of the post-war liberal order. But that whatever succeeds it, and any sort of attempt to create another world order, I think is going to fail even harder. Partly for exactly the reason you raised, Ashley, about the declining energy and all sorts of other material realities. So I write a little bit about this in my forthcoming book, in which I draw on the kind of cultural anthropological literature of the Stranger King, and sort of link Trump to that. This kind of rule breaking character who's kind of in the seat of power, but the way that Stranger King sort of archetype has been dealt with historically is by not allowing him out of his box. He's like, keep him in Washington, keep him sort of playing his game of chess there, but don't let that kind of interfere with what we're doing locally. And maybe there'll be opportunities there, if as I understand it, there's quite a lot of damage being done to sort of government institutions, or the sort of removal of federal power. So presumably there's an opportunity there for local people to kind of step in and create their own kind of their own local forms, their own local strong gods. Another thing that was mentioned is actual God, sort of religious frameworks. I don't think it's a great idea for any humans to assume the mantle of God. So, that we kind of need perhaps to have a discussion about that more transcendent aspect. But why does anyone need Trump, or need these kinds of centralized organs of power? Particularly in the context, again, as you laid it out, Ashley, in the context where increasingly they can't keep people alive, they can't feed people, they can't provide energy, they can't keep the shelves in the stores stocked. We're going to see more and more of that kind of failure of the government side of the bargain, in terms of making life prosperous and sort of making goods available for people. So that's the time when the heroes that we need are us, and not us as individuals, but us, or partly us as individuals or families, but within communities. That would be my take.
Mm.
Yeah, and I'll just note that, Appalachia already is not really known for loving the government or trusting the government, but after Hurricane Helene, the government, in a lot of people's minds, largely failed, right? There's still people who are missing their creek bridge and they can't take their vehicle across the bridge. There are people who lost their homes and they're still living in tents or trailers. And people didn't really expect much difference, but this probably, I think, for a lot of people, reinforced that feeling. Going back to your question, Ashley, about like which part of the strong gods, which part of the weak gods do we want to keep? I think that, I, I think part of this probably inevitable process of relocalization is bringing back strong gods, right? That's, you're bringing, I want to bring this up later, but, note that, a lot of the people around doomer optimism have become religious, kind of all at the same time in one way or the other, or they've come back to religion. And I think that has to do with, being connected to the land, being connected to a place. There's some kind of connection with that, with the sense of transcendence as well, and not relying on your identity on, like, a lot of stuff or diversity, but what's in front of you. There's some link between that and this feeling of transcendence, that, or just the practical need of, like, we need to organize as a community, and we all have different ideas. Well, how have people done this in the past? They're, churches, right? The church has played this role, of organizing communities to get things done. And so I think that's probably a good thing. Now, what I would keep of the weak gods is probably the network, right? The connections we've made along the way. The fact that, many of us have friends who are not part of our clan or tribe, right, or even nation. And we've been able to observe different perspectives, and, hopefully we've been enriched by those different perspectives. So this kind of broad scale network, I think, and, I would also probably want to mention some notion of human rights, right, which I think is also a pretty new phenomenon, and that notion might also have to change in certain ways, and that would be an interesting conversation. But so that leads me to kind of like this kind of cosmo localist or networked localist framework, which feels ideal, but how do we maintain these kind of connections beyond our locality? This kind of global network, which I don't think we want to cut all those ties, but while at the same time putting relatively more energy and emphasis on, our local culture and economy and, relationships. And so
Yeah.
that seems to be kind of the interesting challenge.
Yeah.
We might want to get into this now, but, I think it would be it would be a pivot, so we can wait. But, the thing I emailed about of, you know, what do we see as the role of, the church, or, you know, uh, as many people believe, the strongest God, right? The God, in both facilitating, or what should be the role of the church in facilitating this return to local community economies, and beating away these nasty strong gods that we don't want around,
Okay, so a
not becoming a
couple.
nasty strong god itself.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Right. So a comment, and then we can switch to that. So I've been taking notes. Part of what I was just thinking about recently is this other woman from Unheard, Emily Jasinski, just had an interview with Glenn Greenwald, and they're talking about the woke right, and it's just sort of like the same exact kind of mob is forming on the right under Trump now, and trying to take away like free speech and due process and all of this stuff. And it was just like, you were so mad about it when the other side did it, just because you're in power. Like, do not erode these institutions. If you believe in these institutions at all, if the other side gets power, they'll be more and more eroded. So as far as the weak gods part goes, I don't know if this is even considered part of the, globalist liberal order, but I think it kind of is. Due process, balance of powers, free speech, tolerance. You're not going to walk back in the Americas that we're a diversity of people. You're just not going to walk that back. So you have to have some way to love your neighbor and have some tolerance, human rights, these network connections, like you were saying, Jason. Best part of the strong gods, local self-determination, this neighborly love, individuals, families, community level, this concept of thumos, which I always use the word agency, which is a sociology term, but I liked this thumos concept. Like, let's have some determination, let's have some gumption, let's have some like pride in our culture, and the things that we can make and create as a people. Now the question is, this religious question, I think, ties into a bigger conundrum, which is, how do you walk back from this liberal order, which is about preaching sort of like diversity and tolerance, but then to an extent, if you preach diversity and tolerance so far that you accept things that are outside of what you would deem morally correct in your own society, just because and your neighbors are doing it, and your neighbors come in and there's more of your neighbors, and I don't want to like get into xenophobia or the immigration debate, but you need to have some sort of like moral compass or cultural center where you say like, we have tolerance, but up to a certain point. And then there are laws that determine that those things are outside of the, sort of moral framework that we're willing to accept. But the failure of the sort of liberal tolerant state is just sort of more and more acceptance of things further and further outside of some moral center. Like there is no moral center. It doesn't really matter. Anything goes because we just want to be like accepting and tolerant. So where do you find that moral center? Is it church? And how do you, if it is church or some, sort of like acceptance of a Judeo-Christian moral framework, how do you stop that from becoming a bad, strong God as well? I mean, it's basically like the hardest question in civilization, but maybe we'll make Chris answer it.
I'm always ready to answer the hardest questions in civilization. Well, let me try and answer it slowly. Let me work my way to it, because actually something kind of building on a point that both of you made just then, I think in different ways, which maybe can lead us into it. I think, I didn't know what thumos meant. I had to look it up, but obviously NS Lyons has got a kind of classical, training in classical ideas. But one of the things that surprises me on that basis is I was thinking of Aristotle's framework for politics, and he has this kind of 3x2 grid. You can have rule by the one, king, basically, rule by the few, an aristocracy, or rule by the many, democracy. And he says that that can work quite well if it's geared to the good of society, to the good of all, or if it's motivated by self-interest. It can be disastrous. Kings become tyrants, aristocracies become just narrow oligopolies, and democracy for the ancient Greeks was a nightmare, because it was the mob, which I think was the point you were making, Ashley. And I think Lyons plays into that. He sort of says it's great that Trump's sort of just stampeding through all these these boring bureaucratic, and it's a difficult one, because to a degree I sort of agree, that there is a kind of ossification in bureaucracy, but that's partly because democracy is about more than the fact that Trump got 1% more of the vote than Harris did, and therefore can do whatever he likes. That's not democracy. You need to have, democracy is about sort of checks and balances and dialogue. But you're right, but the way you set out the sort of religious framing, I think, is right, Ashley. The sort of liberalism is kind of like, well, we can't all agree on these sort of big issues about the meaning of life, so let's rule that out of politics, and we'll have experts and technocrats will kind of manage it all for us, and we'll just concentrate, you do you, I'll do me, we'll all get richer and everyone will be happy. And Lyons' critique of that, and and also your point about the kind of material and financial frameworks, that's not going to work anymore. So so I guess I myself have gone down that route of coming from a kind of secular, sort of little bit left-wing liberal kind of framework, and increasingly finding myself drawn into a kind of an appreciation of the need for a kind of transcendent framework, or you might frame it as a sort of strong God framework. Now, I don't know if the church, I think it is worth going back. It's very easy to critique the Enlightenment and modernity, and I do it the whole time in my writing, but it's kind of good to remember what the original the sort of guys that formulated that were kicking out against, and it was essentially people claiming the mantle of God, saying, if you say that God is on your side and get enough people to believe you, God is a powerful ally, and so the impetus to decenter God and say, just because you're wearing some fancy clothes and claim to have God speaking in your ear, that's not good enough for me. The problem is that by getting rid of God, you don't really get rid of that way of being. You just reinvent it in terms of science, or the will of the people, or some kind of secular version of you have to do what I say. But I think getting away from you have to do what I say. I mean, really fast people like Tyson Yunker Porter, Australian Aboriginal writer, sort of, the thing about indigenous culture is nobody ever tells anybody what they should do. Orders are not something that you sort of get in those cultures, and the idea of a vote, like we all put our hand up and the majority, that's what we do, is kind of anathema. So we definitely need to find a different framework and a move to the transcendent. But I think, Lyons, I think in his Unheard interview, he kind of flip-flopped a bit between quite a libertarian, everyone should do what they want, and quite a sort of almost a theocratic position. We need a God, and we need interpreters of God to tell us what to do. I think it's going to be a disaster if we have that sort of theocratic, some kind of hierarchy of people claiming to be the interpreters of the truth and godly positions. And you kind of see that the whole time, that sort of claim to be a higher person because of access to God. What we need to do, I mean, I did a podcast with you guys and Sean Domenchik and talking about distributism and the Catholic tradition, and I find that kind of Thomist tradition of, which again draws from Aristotle, this idea that we need to have a kind of living critical tradition. The way you framed it exactly right, Ashley. I think we need to sort of know, who we are, what we stand for, what our tradition is. That mustn't be kind of ossified. It mustn't be left in the hands of the few to tell the many what to do. But we need a kind of critical tradition that's grounded in the transcendent, in a sense of the divine. I mean, I struggle with it, having had such a secular background all my life. I kind of want to believe in God and can't quite, but I do see the death of God in modernism as a problem. So we need that, but you can't. It's not something you can just snap your fingers and sort of create this tradition overnight and say, right, we're going to believe in this, and these people are going to sort of tell us what to do. This is a sort of collective. This is the challenge of our and future generations, to create this kind of critical tradition, a sort of virtue ethics that isn't coming top down from a pope or some great leader, that is built bottom up. And whether the existing churches can do that, I don't know. The advantage of them is that they're still here, and they've got this sort of hallowed depth of tradition that it's hard to sort of invent new secular traditions, which is partly again why I think figures like Trump, as long as we don't take him too seriously, can be quite good. It's sort of like, it's good to have these authority figures and all the pomp of elections and sort of White Houses or Westminster or whatever, but let's not take them too seriously. We are the real politicians, and we have to ground that orientation to divine over the long term in our own practice. So, and I think the church or churches or religions are important in that, because they draw on that tradition, and because of the wisdom of many of their teachings, for sure, and orientation to the idea that it's not just a kind of completely empty materialist world, that there is a kind of spiritual ties and binds connecting us all to the wider creation. but it's hard to get there from where we are now because we've destroyed so much of that.
Yeah, and for me, when I think about tradition, I mean, I think about the plurality of traditions, right? And I mean, that United States in particular in the context, and maybe England to some degree as well, but it's very Protestant, right? And so that means that there's thousands of in many cases hyper local traditions, right? One little town could have its own denomination.
Yeah.
um, and I think if we trace kind of, at least in the United States, which is what I'm most familiar with in a Protestant context in particular, you see with the rise of modernity post World War II, you also see the rise of the modern, church. And today I think it's like the non-denominational church with like the pastors in jeans and they have a rock band,
And there's a
uh,
thousand people
and there's a
or
thousand people and everybody lives in a suburb and drives their Suburban to church, right? And it's almost like this perfect reflection of the society. And for me, I mean, I think one thing that, you know, I see this phenomenon, and maybe it's just anecdotal, but there seems to be a trend towards lack of satisfaction with secularism in general. And so I think that there's a lot of people searching. Um, but I think, so I think that there's a lot of energy going into the tradition or the church or the churches, in plural. But I think, there's a big question for me of like, the church itself needs to reform. It cannot, it cannot continue to be the suburban church, you know, that has the rock band and is very extremely comfortable with modernity. At the same time, I don't want it to draw in and become the hyper paranoid, very closed in church either. Um, at the same time, I don't want it to be just only the cosmopolitan, say big city church that, a lot of the people there don't actually really believe anything, but they're there for social justice and the church allows them to do that, right? So seems like if we break it down into like let's just say the urban church, the suburban church, and the rural church, there's failure modes of each, right? And I don't have any answers here, but a live question for me is, what would a new Reformation mean? The first Reformation came associated with the printing press. Now we have the internet. What would a new Reformation mean where the church recognizes what time it is, in
Mm,
terms of
Mm.
civilizational transition, and can actually be a vital force in facilitating people through this into and through this transition, and what would that mean for the urban church, the suburban church, and the rural church?
mm.
Those kind of
Um,
typologies, I guess.
I would, I mean, I would tie this back to this bigger materialist question that we've been asking on this podcast from the beginning, which is, like, why do you have a homestead? Okay, why do you try to produce food for yourself? It's silly. You can just buy all this stuff at the store, whatever. Because it's spiritually good to have this connection, to plant a tree and to tend it and to teach your children about it and to notice the pollinators on it and to be a part of that web. And so I think like religion similarly, and probably also we talk about this on this podcast a lot with regard to marriage and family, and also like a civic orientation. In all of those things, we're sort of being forced by material circumstances to come up with this virtue ethics. And it is happening, I think, both from the material, sort of like I want to take care of my children well. I'm not like, COVID was a big eye-opening thing. Like, I don't know what my children are doing. They're home now and I'm like finally getting to know them. And people had this big awakening, like, wow, I actually love my family, want to spend more time with them. I want to get involved in my in civics, in some sort of civic organizations, in my local school, and cleanup projects and whatever else, and those material experiences, or I would add sitting in the church and or sitting at mass, at least for me, is for me an individual attempt to sort of like push through spiritual questions and about meaning and my role in the world and how to be a moral person and to contribute well to my society. And so I think we're just sort of seeing this cascading interest in these things. And I'm saying these things on purpose on this podcast because I think there's a real shadow side to all of these impulses as well, as we've been talking about with, nationalism or xenophobia, or, you can mistake that as like, we're returning to a more ordered society from this disorder of liberalism and bureaucracy and globalism. But it's actually another totally disordered way of doing
Mm.
things. And so it's not the reason this podcast is not exploded in popularity is because the answer is not very satisfying. Like, yeah, rah rah, Trump hugging the flag. It's not satisfying really because it's not really lizard brain. It's more like, hey, consider going to church and thinking about your moral responsibility to the world. That's not very fun. But I mean, I just think that's the answer. I think actually I'm noticing, and maybe you can talk about this more, Jason, like all the people affiliated with doomer optimism are sort of coming to similar conclusions about religion, which is surprising because all of us are sort of like liberal secularists for the vast majority of our adulthood. So I do think that there is like just a push in this direction. Again, it's not very satisfying answer, but it is satisfying in the end. You find connections, spiritual guidance, meaning, and that kind of thing. I don't know, Jason, do you want to talk more about that? What you're noticing about people coming to religion, or your thoughts about that?
I mean, just a small anecdote. So, like, who was like originally involved with doomer optimism? You and me, and uh,
Joe.
Tress and Josh Kearns.
Yeah.
All four of these people, in one way or the other, have like, you know, come to or come back to religion in some way,
Mhm.
right? And so I just don't think I don't think that's a coincidence. And I don't know how much social media reflects online, but there does seem to be dissatisfaction with postmodernity. There seems to be a longing for the sacred, and I think one manifestation of that was the homesteading revival kind of enthusiasm during COVID, right? Of like returning to something real, something tangible. And I think this interest in religion is part of it's part of a similar wave in a way. Of coming back to, I guess, universal truths in a way, that you can kind of, orient your life around. So I just think that's happening. And so again, my question is, okay, but if we all just come back to church or, whatever tradition that draws us,
Yeah.
this is not restricted to Christianity, by the way. But if we all come back to some kind of spiritual or religious practice or community, are we all going to join the suburban church and, drive our large SUVs to our big box home and we're going to have our meaning and fulfillment? I don't think so, because if this is tied to, if the culture, what's happening in culture is tied to physical, the material reality, as we were talking about earlier, then that's not going to be satisfying either. And so something is going to have to change about the church writ large. And every tradition is going to be different, right? Catholicism has a rich tradition of the Catholic land movement, and so that would mean some kind of reform from within or change of emphasis, right? But then for Protestantism, it might just be a new denomination that is really into gardening, right? And or an old one that that comes back to. So I mean, in my case, right, like I was interested in rejoining a church. I have kind of a universalist, interpretation of Christianity. And I just ended up going to an Episcopal church because it was rural, for one thing. It sponsors, for example, every year it sponsors the country fair, right? And it's a big deal. It owns the land the country fair is on. And it has a rich agrarian history. So that was really attractive. It has a very kind of formal liturgy which I found just very kind of reassuring in a traditional sense. But it's also people are generally tend to be pretty open minded, in the Episcopal Church, which I also found. So it seemed to combine a lot of elements that I was interested in. The only problem is that the average age of the congregation is maybe like 70 years old, right?
Yeah.
And so, and so this speaks again to like, a church like this that kind of checks a lot of boxes for me. What transformation is it going to need to go through to appeal to the younger generations and become a vital force in society? And that's just an
Mm.
active question that I'm thinking about. I've talked to the priest about it. He's kind of on a similar page. I don't know.
Yeah, I have a question for you, Chris, but I just want to briefly say something. I noticed in my parish, this is the parish, I didn't grow up Catholic where I went to Catholic school, but I grew up Lutheran, but me and my family are going to a Catholic church, which is the same parish my husband grew up in. And there's a huge neighborhood and civic orientation in that church. And there's tons of families and there's a school associated with it. So that's great. But like, I think I've talked about this before, but on the day of the South Side, there's a lot of Irish Catholic, Irish immigrants over the years in this neighborhood. So the day of the South Side Irish Parade, we get bagpipes, which are Scottish, but whatever, close enough. And the police and the firemen, and like it's just a packed house, and everyone's wearing Irish sweaters, and there's just this like sort of grasping at like who are we, what kind of civic orientation do we have both in church and neighborhood. So I've been happy with that. And so it sounds similar to your experience with the country fair, and this connection to not just the four walls of the church, but this connection to civic orientation. And I'd like to say that I think it doesn't have to just be church. I had a whole podcast episode with anarcho-contrarian / Wally Chamberlain about a civic orientation. Like, he's really big into this New England town hall meeting style democracy and these different connections to place through particular ways of doing, politics, democracy that provide a sort of civic pride and a civic orientation and a culture. So I'm curious, Chris, do you grapple with these things in your forthcoming book?
Yeah, I do actually. Probably, I mean, I grapple with probably too many different things in the forthcoming book at the expense of grappling with any of them insufficient depth. But yeah, I do. I mean, it in some ways it's an engagement with Catholicism and distributism, but with sort of but in the sort of wider context of some of the sort of the politics and aspects of the wider world that we've been talking about. But yeah, I mean, a lot of things were firing off as you guys were talking. I mean, one point to make, you mentioned bagpipes from Ireland. A lot of traditional Irish musicians would say that bagpipes came first from Ireland, although now we
Okay.
associate them with Scotland.
With Scotland, yeah.
But I think the important thing there is that it teaches us not to hold tight too much to a notion of a sort of unique cultural tradition,
Right.
to embrace the local, but not to kind of say, no, that's ours. No, that's, that. So,
To hold it lightly, like you said, hold it
yeah,
lightly.
and yeah, there was something else you said, but yeah, I mean, here in the UK, I mean, we do have the Anglican Church, which is a sort of strange beast, but we're very, very Western Europe is very secular compared, well, to pretty much anywhere else in the world, to the US and other places. But, my mother grew up in a coal mining community that was sort of Methodist, and I remember her stories of, there was the Methodist chapel, and then there was the strict Methodist chapel, and then there was the strict and particular Methodist chapel. And I was reading someone the other day writing about this in terms of rupture, that's the sort of Protestant way is rupture, and that in a sense led into the sort of secular modernity. It's about critique, it's about expressing how you're different from what's gone before, whereas other religious traditions, and Catholicism being an obvious example, is kind of the opposite. It's like you can be creative and new, but you're always looking to connect that to some wider tradition, and that I think is really important in the future. And also your point about sort of lively food production and so on, the spirituality of producing a livelihood for yourself. And that, again, we touched on that earlier, but that's where I think NS Lyons and I mentioned Perry Anderson from the New Left in my article about NS Lyons. Same mistake, that the left has never embraced sort of local live, or well, there are elements of the left have, but not the mainstream elements. And that is a really critical part of spirituality, which perhaps is coming back into some churches. That sense of you know having the capacity to create a local livelihood, because if we don't have that, as I think you alluded to, you get this very thin sort of "I love Trump" or "I love Musk," I make America great. It's a very kind of thin type of spirit, of thumos, to use Lyons's term. Whereas if you're really grounded in in your local place and making a livelihood, but also connecting outside that, that's much more powerful. So I think we definitely need to to build that. But I guess I looked up. I've forgotten the name of the who was the strong gods guy that Lyons was drawing from.
R. Reno, Rusty Reno.
Reno, right? Yeah. So
Reno.
I haven't read his book. I looked him up on Wikipedia prior to this podcast to make it seem like I sort of was, was erudite. And I noticed one thing that he said was that he'd converted to Catholicism because with Protestantism he needed some kind of logic, some rationale, whereas he didn't need that with the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church is just there. And I thought that was really interesting and sort of appealing. I think that's kind of what we need, but is also problematic. That's, that, as you said, it's a really tough question. We need traditions not to be ossified. We need, not for there to be people as self-appointed custodians of a tradition that must never be questioned. But the problem is we've had too much of that rupture, too much of that questioning, too much of that kind of alienation from any sense of connection and sort of being part of a wider spiritual community of beings, not just humans. So that I think is precisely the sort of the sort of eye of the needle that we have to thread. But sorry, I've forgotten what your original question was.
That's good. I don't know if Jason has something to add to this, but I specifically I said, okay, if I'm going to go back to church, I've spent so many like parts of my life, like let's just say, for example, before ever having kids, I read all this anthropology, and then I read all these like child psychologists. I read psychology. I read the New School. I read all these different things about like how to think about motherhood and attachment and love. And I was like, I'm just going to go to mass and not read anything, and I'm just going to go and sit there and see what happens. And I think that that's a really interesting thing because I had heard some similar kind of critiques of Catholics, like really, there's some people online who are staunch Catholics, super hard into it, but then they think a lot about it to the point that they're almost becoming Protestant because then they're critiquing Catholicism. And it's like, kind of the point is just to go and you just agree with the hierarchy and you wrestle with it in your own way, but in a public sense, you don't really like critique it. You just go there and this is what the hierarchy is. Your pope is your pope, and no matter if you like love him or hate him, that's what it is. So that's something curious. I have a controversial question to end with, but I don't know if Jason, you want to say anything else about this religious question or some of Chris's thoughts.
Nothing that coherent. I mean, I was just thinking in mind that, not all Protestantism is built the same, right? You have, apostle, the kind of the very charismatic, very schismatic, end, and then you have the very high church end. You mentioned like Anglican, Episcopals are just American Anglicans, by the way. That's kind of the tradition that I've been drawn towards. But I think that, I mean, that I don't know. Lately, I've just found all religion fascinating, but so I think that I guess what I'm trying to say is that there's this spectrum, and I think within any tradition or across traditions, you can see different aspects of this spectrum of, hyper critique, schismatic, which that leads to, and then hyper, adherence and stagnation, kind of top down. And so you have these kind of two extreme types. And however any tradition or a set of traditions navigates that, my like I joined this particular church just because it happened to be nearby, and it happened to have agrarian history, and it just
Mm.
it checked a lot of boxes. But it wasn't this particular denomination. It could have been if if that was a Catholic church and it checked all those boxes. So so I guess for me, it's going back to like, in some ways, religion is a reflection of culture. In some ways, it generates culture, right? It's this feedback loop. So I'm going back to, again, in what ways can religion not just be a reflection of culture, 21st century modernity, but in what ways can it lead culture, understanding what time it is?
Mm,
And I
mm.
don't know which tradition, if there's any single tradition that has a lock on that. So I guess
No, no, yeah.
that's all I would say.
Okay, I have a controversial and kind of funny question to end with, which is, okay, so we know that there's like an orthodoxy, a liberal orthodoxy of what you must say about Trump at all times. But I'm wondering, all of us, kind of, I guess, at least former liberals or maybe current liberals, do you think at all, do you ever have have a moment where you think that Trump is both a fool, but also kind of an agitator in potentially a good way? And like he's got some amount of thumos in the sense that he at least is like disrupting this like global hegemonic order of bureaucrats and Davos people. And can either of you hold lightly, like we were talking about earlier, this holding lightly concept where he can be both like a fool and somewhat ridiculous, but also there are points at which you're kind of like, oh, well, that maybe could be good. I don't know. Or we're like, you see him on the stage and he's like dancing, and it's just like there's some sense of like fun or like joie de vivre or like agency. And he's just like, I'm just going to do things. And there's something more interesting about that, at least. So I'm curious if either of you can admit to any positive feelings about the Orange Man.
You
Well,
want
I
me to go first, Chris, or you want to go?
sure, yeah. Well, I mean, I suppose, funnily enough, back when he was elected in 2016, I was in more fully kind of liberal left mode then, and I was sort of outraged and kind of the whole kind of, oh, he's a fascist kind of thing sort of got to me a
Mm.
bit. I mean, obviously I'm not in the US, it's a bit different, but whereas this time round I was kind of a bit indifferent to it, and in a sense that perhaps speaks to your question, and I sort of, I mean, sort of NS Lyons worries me a bit because I was think maybe saying to Jason before we started that I kind of feel it's not Trump himself, but the people that are trying to sort of elevate him and sort of be the camp followers and say that he's this kind of, and sort of part of what he's articulating does look a bit like the trade war leading to actual war, and the charismatic leader, all a bit problematic. But I can admit to to a part of your question, and I think it's partly the, as I said earlier, it's partly the Joker aspect and not taking it too seriously, and sort of using, I mean, it kind of derives out of Jason's question as well. What can the church do? Can it step up? And I think possibly it can, but it's a long-term cultural process, and that is going to involve disruption. And I kind of think even if Harris had been elected, or we had or as we have here, this kind of boring, supposedly centre-left kind of neoliberal sort of version of social democracy, ultimately they don't have the answers. The disruption is going to happen anyway, one way or the
Yeah.
other.
Yeah.
Whether I want to take this kind of accelerationist position and sort of say, yeah, Trump, go for it. But I do think it. Again, I'll be interested when you guys have a look at. Hopefully, if you take a read of my new book and my Stranger King analysis of Trump, it sort of interests me because I think, it is partly about the using the sort of disruption and the bizarreness. We give too much credence to the central state and think it's too important, and we need to step back from that and use its kind of theatricality to define better local politics. And, one of the problems, I was interesting you mentioning the New England town meeting sort of thing, because if that's deeply part of your culture, that's great. And particularly if you have land and you're farming and, you have to decide certain things, but you have a degree of autonomy from that. And that's what I think we need more of. We need more local livelihood autonomy to take some of the, heat out of political decisions. But, if you're able to do that, it can help to have, some dramatic figure in the center, because otherwise, local politics can get quite grim and sort of factionalized, and like every damn aspect of life has to be sort of thought through. So I think, I suppose I would, that there is a more negative way that this could all go, but the more positive way it could go is kind of using that, the bizarre disruptions that are going to happen anyway, kind of defining ourselves a little bit against that kind of politics, to generate, a better kind of local politics than we might otherwise do if we were sort of, doing it on our own, purely sort of from the bottom up. So short answer is yes, but I don't know.
Yeah. Well, that's fine. That's fair. Jason?
Yeah, I mean, I would reflect a lot of what Chris said. I think I see him as kind of an inevitability, kind of this consolidation of a bunch of forces that, have been, you know, simmering for a long time. The accelerationist part of me that, says that, the system is just going to keep running as long as it possibly can until it collapses catastrophically. Well, this might be speeding that up, like in a ultimately less catastrophic way, because you're not waiting till the absolute end. And so there's an accelerationist part of me that you know uh finds it kind of thrilling. I also look at a lot of his specific policies that I really don't like, in particular around how he thinks about immigrants and these types of things. So I think that there are real scapegoats, there are real victims in this process. But there's victims in the previous process as well, right? There's always going to be victims. I think one thing that might be interesting is how the left, or how kind of Democrats or whatever equivalent in the country, if and how they respond and reform, right? Like, are they going to recognize that there's something real here, that there's real energy that Trump reflects, that people have a hunger and a desire. Maybe it's for a healthy, strong God again, in their lives, and are they going to recognize that? Is this going to cause reformation on their side, right?
Mm.
So that would be potentially a good long-term outcome. Yeah, but who knows? I mean, this tariff situation is interesting because from a degrowth perspective, tariffs are one way to bring about degrowth. Maybe not the smoothest way, maybe not maybe not the most kind of progressively distributive way, right? It's probably going to be the poorest people who suffer the most, and it's not like this scientifically managed degrowth where the rich pay the most and the poor, after their lives get better.
Hmm.
It's not that kind of degrowth, right? But it might be degrowth nonetheless, right? It might actually result in more local, or national manufacturing. It might result in people getting, this doesn't have to do with tariffs, but like the whole thing with chicken eggs, right? And eggs are like $10 a dozen now. Maybe we'll get chickens if the prices go higher because of tariffs or other policies of. So there could be things that come out of that could be positive.
Yep, it's a very doomer optimist realization. It's just like, yeah, it just seems like, I mean, we're in. I'm convinced we're moving to this era of strong gods. It's very messy. There are better and worse ways to respond to it. I think we did a pretty good job of laying out some of at least the constellations of things that look a little better and look a little worse. I think probably better than, at least from what I've heard, the R.R. Reno or Rusty Reno book didn't have a lot of like specific recommendations, more just laying out this theory. And so I'd like to continue this conversation. We're going to try to get NS Lyons on to defend himself. um, and maybe get more into the details, because he didn't really get too much into the details, more just sort of like, yeah, we're in this era that it is what it is kind of thing. So I welcome you both back to have that conversation. Although we're inviting Josh Kearns on too, so it'll be four
Good.
against one. But that's okay. He can
We'll
handle.
see. I haven't signed up for the NS Lyons one yet, but I am excited about Chris releasing his new book
Yes.
and reading that book and getting you on again. I think, late this year, probably November,
Yeah.
December sometime,
Yeah,
to talk about your new book. And I think that will be a nice kind of a sequel to this conversation.
Yeah, I
yeah.
think Chris, I would say I want you to have the last word, but you are our, like, I would say, political economist, almost social theorist. You're the one who thinks the most about the answers to these questions of anyone, I think. At least, even if it's, this sort of nuanced, thinking through everything at once difficulty, you are at the bleeding edge of that. So, any last word to Chris?
Oh, well, thanks very much. Well, I mean, I always enjoy coming on the pod, so yeah, it would be great to have a chat about the new book with you. No, I mean, well, yeah, there's any number of more things we could say, but I mean, I do think it does lead into the new book nicely, because it's, partly it's very much about how do we make it possible for people to, produce local livelihoods, to access land, to sort of think through work, family, sort of household relationships and so on, and how do we orient to the spiritual in a way that doesn't make such a goddamn mess of things that we that we have through both kind of left and right wing versions of modernism. So it's all sort of very apropos of all of that. So yeah, I mean, it's always great being on the pod, so I look forward to more
Yeah,
discussions.
this is great. When is the book coming out, or do we not have a date yet?
It's mid-October in the UK and mid-November in the US, so
Okay,
sometime around then.
good.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, we'll have that discussion closer to that date. Thank you both for coming on. This was great. Oh, geez. All
Good to see
right,
you guys again. Take care.
bye.